If you have $1 to $5 million saved and you're planning for your retirement, you probably have a lot of questions. How long will my money last? When should I take Social Security? What if I want to buy a second home or help my kids? Well, most financial planning is generic. Your life isn't. I'm Dr. Brock Bennion, and I'm a financial advisor in Tacoma, Washington, and the owner of Kimball Creek Partners. Today, I want to explain my exact financial planning process for a couple in their mid to late 50s who are getting ready to retire and have approximately $2 million saved. Now, this may or may not describe you, but I hope that the principles I discuss here will help you gain greater clarity about your personal situation. My goal is to pull back the curtain and show you the exact process we use to move our clients from speculation to a strategy they can feel confident in. We use a scientific approach to stress test your life against market volatility and the personal goals that you have. If you want to gain increased clarity about your financial future, this is the walkthrough that you've been looking for. Forgive me, but my approach to financial planning is somewhat unique. So I want to start by explaining why. My background is in science. I got my PhD studying viruses and autoimmune diseases. And a fair question would be, why should you hire a scientist to be your financial advisor? Well, science at its core is one way that we create knowledge or discover new knowledge. The objective of a scientist is to become an expert in a field and figure out where the gap in knowledge is. Then they ask questions and design experiments to fill that gap. Now, perhaps the most exciting thing going on in personal finance right now is how easy it is to get knowledge quick within a field. If you want to know about safe withdrawal rates or Roth conversions or when to take Social Security, there are nearly unlimited resources available to you. But there's a problem. How you, specifically you, the individual, retires, pays off med school debt, or saves for your kids' college, that is a gap in knowledge because every person is unique. So what we need to do is apply best principles to your unique values and circumstances to fill that gap and essentially create new knowledge. My training as a scientist has been incredibly valuable as I have helped hundreds of individuals and families gain clarity on their financial future by taking the best financial principles and applying them to their life. To do this, we begin by creating a financial model of their life, which we can then use to ask specific questions, not the generic, how much money should somebody withdraw during retirement, but how much money should John or Diana or Quinn withdraw during retirement? And from what account should John, Diana, or Quinn withdraw from first? And a host of other questions depending on what the client needs. This process follows 3 steps: facts, plans, and what-ifs. Let's walk through what this looks like in practice using an example. This is Jerome and Lucy Johnson. They have right around $2.1 million in investable assets and a net worth of around $3 million. What this planning software allows us to do is aggregate a lot of information into one spot so that then when we ask your questions, we're getting answers using your specific data. I won't walk through everything we collect, but let's hit the highlights and I will show you how we don't just look at data, but we begin to create an actual plan. First, some basic biographical numbers. Jerome is 57, Lucy is 53. They plan to retire at 62. They have a son and a daughter and a grandchild, and their life expectancy is 98. Now, when it comes to retirement age, this is where we started to make a plan already. 62 isn't a fact. That's a goal and something that could change based on circumstances. Additionally, life expectancy isn't known. We have to make an assumption. But by putting in different values, we can test different outcomes. I usually start with 98 because many people worry about running out of money in retirement, so let's start with a big lifespan. We then move through a discussion where we can input a client's financial priorities and values. For example, for Jerome, the biggest thing was planning for retirement, creating retirement income, and minimizing taxes. But Lucy also was very interested in maximizing their investments. As we start to look at goals, we can put in specific dollar values for what they're trying to accomplish. So during retirement, how much do they estimate that they're going to need? When they retire, they want to do some traveling. So we put in a dollar value and a time frame for what that's going to look like. For their granddaughter, Kylie, they want to pay for college. And so we estimate $20,000 in today's dollars and 4 years for schooling. That leave to heirs number at the bottom is worth dwelling on for a moment. Some clients have children, others don't. Some wish to leave big sums of money to their heirs, others don't. But even if you've read the book Die with Zero, very few clients actually want to have $0 when they die. That could make for a very stressful last few years. So by putting a number here, we effectively tell our model we want at least this value left in our accounts at the end of life. It provides a cushion, and most clients like to include it in planning. We are, of course, able to aggregate multiple investment accounts as well as personal property values and any liabilities that a client may have. Now, when it comes to income, current income is often a straightforward data point. We can pull this from a W-2 or a tax return or just a pay stub. But in retirement, it is common for there to be other income sources. Social Security is a big one. So we always have our clients go to ssa.gov and get an estimate of what their Social Security would be. That is data. But then we also want to plan. When should you take Social Security? In this scenario, we're planning for Jerome to take it at 70 as a base case. Lastly, we're putting in Lucy's pension because she's going to receive that from her school when she retires. Let's finish by going over some expenses and a summary page of the savings as well. Here, we want all the expenses that the family incurs in a given year. It's actually easiest to start at the bottom of the page. Based on the income sources from the previous page, plus the projected growth of the taxable accounts and withdrawals from retirement accounts, the system will automatically estimate taxes at the federal level as well as state level if that's important. Then we pull in information such as insurance premiums, as well as the numbers that we put in for their travel goals and education goals that we put on that previous page. And finally, we have what's called living expenses. This is essentially a catch-all category. Now, some clients like to break their budget out into food, entertainment, and other specific categories, but that can be cumbersome to update in the model. So we tend to lump all of those data points into a single living expenses category that catches everything not covered below. And when you add up all of those numbers, you get a total expenses for the family for the year. Really quickly, just look at savings. Where Jerome and Lucy are expected to work for a couple more years, they're going to continue to add to their 401ks or continue to add to their Roth accounts or their different savings vehicles. And we want to be able to put that into the system so we're accounting for those contributions and that future growth. At this point, we are ready to start looking at some plans and asking some what-ifs. And this is where the process gets really powerful. Let's start by looking at the base plan. I've named this plan Retire at 62, Take Social Security at 70. It's not a catchy name, but it is very descriptive. So there are scores of reports that can be generated at this point. But I like to look at the plan in two ways: cash flow and statistical projections of success. When it comes to cash flow, we always want to start at the very beginning because money gets somewhat funny or intangible when you project it over 30 years. So for example, somebody might look at this and say, I'm going to end with $9.6 million when I die. Why would I ever need that much money? But what you need to remember is that inflation is going to decrease your buying power. So in this scenario, today, Lucy and Jerome are spending or have total expenses of $346,000. But if we scroll down to the bottom, we can see that, man, there are years that they might be spending $742,000 in a year. With that in mind, it's important to start from a place of confidence. So we begin with reviewing the first 2 years with clients just to make sure that that sounds reasonable. Do these next 2 years of total expenses, does that sound reasonable? You're not expected to withdraw anything off your accounts. In fact, you have a net savings of $40,000 to $43,000. Does that sound reasonable? Because if we start looking at these first few years, we can have more confidence that our projections are at least heading in the direction that we want. After we've established that the first couple years look correct, we want to start looking at the idea of a probability of success. Now, remember, we're defining success as having at least $900,000 in today's dollars to leave to heirs at the end of life. But to get there, we need our assets to grow at a rate that doesn't deplete our accounts too fast. And we have to make assumptions about what the growth of those assets will be. Now, in retirement planning, we talk about sequence of returns risk, meaning if the market gives you a return at the wrong time, that becomes a risk. Now, we might say that the market has an average of 8%, but that could be because one year it returned -8, the next year positive 32, followed by a year of no return. Well, that is mathematically an average of 8%, but it's fundamentally different from returning 8%, then 8%, then 8%. So instead of doing just a straight line projection saying we're going to get a 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 to 10% return, we do what is known as a Monte Carlo scenario. This is a mathematical process that runs hundreds of different scenarios where the market returns vary in the order that they arrive. What that means is that you end up with a band of possibilities. Here, you can see that based on average markets, you might end up tracking the upper blue line, or you might end up tracking the lower gold line. That depends on when the returns come. It usually works out that if you get a bunch of negative returns early on in retirement, you tend to track that lower gold line. But if you tend to get good returns early on, you track that upper blue line, with the average being the dark blue line in the middle. Looking at all of that, you get a probability that your line won't dip below your stated goal at any point during your life, and that gives you your probability of success. All right, let's dive back into the planning. Now, previously, if you were paying attention on those earlier slides, we said that during retirement, Jerome's and Lucy's living expenses, that catch-all category, would go from $145,000 per year to $170,000 a year. And if I toggle that on and off, you can see that staying at $170,000 during retirement, you go to an 84% probability of success. Previously, we said that during retirement, Jerome and Lucy's living expenses would go from $145,000 per year to $170,000 per year. Remember that living expenses is a catch-all category. Well, we may have decided that that was a little ambitious, so we built in a little toggle here that lets us adjust. So when it's off, you're at $170,000 per year in living expenses during retirement, and you get this probability of success of 84%. But if Jerome and Lucy said, you know what, I want a higher probability than that. What if we just kept spending at our current level of 145? We don't increase spending in retirement. Well, we can toggle that on, and we see that that bumps them up to a probability of success of 95%. Now, with that 95% probability of success and total assets at the end of their life at an average rate of 9.6 million, maybe Jerome is feeling pretty confident, and he says, you know what? It's always been my goal to buy a mountain cabin. If I could get a cabin in the mountains when I retire, I would be thrilled. I never thought that was a possibility. Well, let's build that into the plan. Let's say that in 2031, they purchase a mountain cabin for $700,000. And since they don't want to carry debt into retirement, they do it with cash. So we can toggle on that switch here. What we'll see is the system will recalculate. You can see this yellow bar popping up. That's a withdrawal to pay for the purchase of the house. Our probability of success has now dropped down to 82%. This is a fine base plan. It's a good place to start. Now, I personally like to see that success number a little higher, but this is where the what-ifs come in. Now, remember, we spent a lot of time gathering our facts, building our initial plan, and now we're getting down to that final step, what-ifs. I think this is perhaps the most important part of the financial planning process, because the what-ifs are what keep you up at night. I always say nobody lies in bed at night saying, gosh, where am I going to find a full-service financial planner who can organize my data into one coherent scientific model? Nobody thinks that. I think that. Nobody else thinks that. What they do lie in bed thinking about is, what if I or my spouse have a long-term care event? What if my living expenses increase by $30,000 a year? What if my aging parent needs to move in with me and we need to remodel the garage into a mother-in-law suite? Those what-if questions are what keep us up at night. And now that we've built a financial model of your life, we can ask those questions using your data. So let's start asking. I'm going to open up my what-if scenarios that I've previously built in right here. What if we took Social Security earlier? Here's a common question. I love it because it's one that we all have to confront at one point in our life. What we can see is that taking Social Security for Jerome at 62 versus 70 only changes the probability of success by 1%. And when we're projecting out 40 years into the future, that 1% is somewhat negligible. What that means is that for Jerome and Lucy, the question of Social Security is not cut and dry. It is much more nuanced. We can look at whether there is a tax reason to delay, and we can look at their tax return, we can project out their future RMDs, and we can get really granular about what's the best tax strategy for them. Or we can ask whether the money in Jerome and Lucy's early 60s would be more valuable than waiting until they're 70. Would they be more likely to take a trip? Would they be better positioned to help their kids or grandkids? Knowing it's not a question of running out of money, we can look more holistically at their lives to get a better answer for them. Now, maybe Lucy and Jerome like the idea of taking Social Security early, but they think 81% is just a little too low. They don't want to have that many outlier events that could derail them. So you can ask another what if. Well, if we are committed to buying the cabin, what if we plan to sell it later on in life? We can model this. We can go ahead and come down here and say that after 15 years, so when they're in their early 80s, you go ahead and sell the cabin for $800,000, right? They enjoyed it for 15 years and then they decided to move on. You can see that green bar right here. Sorry for the window that pops up. That green bar right there shows the income from the cabin being sold, and our probability of success is back up into the 90s. That might make them feel more comfortable that buying the cabin is a balance sheet move. It's not like they're taking the money and just spending it on something that goes away. They're taking the money and they're shifting it to a different part of their balance sheet. They're buying real estate, which will probably have some value 15 years into the future and can be liquidated to continue funding other goals in retirement. Let's ask another question. What if we traveled more? They might be looking at this and saying, well, if we start to track that upper light blue line that markets are doing really well, and we're kind of targeting towards that 7.8 million at the end of retirement, that seems like a lot of money. We'd like to enjoy it now. What if we spent more on our travel goals? We build that in. We say, what if you spend an extra $20,000 per year in travel expenses between 2034 and 2044? You plug that in, the system looks at it, we can see that probability of success. And if we want to get really granular, we go down below and we actually look at the numbers, the cash flow, say, do these numbers sound reasonable? One thing that I want to point out here, right, is you can see where different income sources come in. So for example, here is where Jerome is starting to take Social Security, right? He turns 62, Social Security starts to get paid. Here you have the first full year of Social Security, and then it continues to go forward. When Lucy turns 62, her pension starts, and you get this other income. But that raises an additional what if. What if Lucy passes early and her pension income is tied completely to her life? We can model that as well. We have the data. We can ask that specific question for these clients. We put that in, it recalculates, and we see a 73% probability of success. Why? Well, now you have income for a period of time, and then prior to Jerome passing, when Jerome is 82 and he's going to live to be 98 in this scenario, she passes and this income stops. The reason it's this 1.4 is if you remember back on that previous page, there were some life insurance policies that they had, and that helps kind of defray the cost of losing the pension. I hope you can see that the what ifs keep spiraling. At this point, if we were contemplating Lucy passing early, you might then ask, what if Jerome reduced his expenses? What if Jerome sold his primary residence, which we're not currently counting on in any of these projections? I actually love it when people think about their primary home as somewhat as of a backstop or a safety net. Because if you're like Jerome and you're the surviving spouse, there's not necessarily somebody right next to you to take care of you as you age. And you might need to move into an assisted living facility sooner than you would have if you had had a spouse living with you. Or maybe if you aren't married or if you don't have kids, that you're going to need that assistance. Having that backstop of real estate to sell and liquidate to fund the later years of retirement can be a good way to kind of insulate your plan. Well, the what ifs go on and on and on. What if I change locations? What if I move closer to my kids? What if I reduce my spending? What if we took out a bigger life insurance policy on Lucy to protect against lost pension income? The list goes on and on. And now we have a financial model built of your life, and we can ask these questions in a very targeted, direct way. Now, there's a quote loosely attributed to Dwight D. Eisenhower that goes something like, "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." When we build a financial plan like this, planning is an ongoing process. One thing is for certain, you will not plan one time and then follow that plan exactly for 30 years. Because just like General Eisenhower knew, battle plans don't survive the battle. And life changes far more frequently than one planning session can account for. That is why I'm a huge advocate of consistent planning. Do the work at the beginning. It's a lot of work to gather all this data and bring it together. But once you have organized and understand where you are today, it becomes a process of maintaining and updating the plan as your life changes, because your plan should change with you. But how do you do that without taking up a bunch of your time? That is why we built the On Track with Clarity process. What I found is that we'll go through this process with clients, and it's really good and it's really successful, but they don't necessarily want to engage with it every single month for the rest of time. So how do we keep people on top of things without creating a bunch of work for them? We made a list of areas that we felt a person should address and continually update in order to stay on top of their financial plan. And we gave it an acronym, CLARITY. That stands for current financial position, legacy, asset preservation, retirement cash flow and goals, investing smarter, tax planning, and your life, because you got to have fun along the way. For clients that we have an ongoing relationship with, we follow a yearly schedule broken into quarters, where every quarter has a certain emphasis. We work through these internally on our end, consistently thinking about our clients. Then, when we come across something that we say, man, when was the last time Lucy and Jerome updated their beneficiaries? We can go back and look. And if it's been a while, we can proactively reach out and say, Jerome, Lucy, I know that you welcomed a grandchild into your family recently, but this grandchild isn't included as a beneficiary along with your other grandchildren. Would you like to make that update? If it's a good time, they engage. If they say, you know what, Brock, it's not really a great time. Can we bring this up at our next review? Then we do that. All of these areas are cycling, and we're constantly staying up to date on the latest laws and taxes, proactively reaching out to our clients about the things most important to their situation. If it's a good time to engage, we engage. And if it's not important to the client right now, or if it doesn't apply, we check that box and we move on. That's what we found is the best way to keep a client's plan up to date without putting a big burden on their shoulders. After all, we're hired to take things off your plate, to simplify your life, to give you back your time so that you can live the retirement you've dreamed of while we take care of things in the background. Financial planning isn't a set it and forget it event. It's a constant adjustment. This is exactly why we built the Clarity system, to keep you on track without adding more to your to-do list. Whether you're concerned about the Washington state specific tax planning, managing your retirement cash flow, or simply looking to organize your assets with a professional, we're here to help. If you have what-if questions that need real dollar answers, visit the link in the description below to schedule a discovery call with me, either here in Tacoma or anywhere virtually. We work with clients around the country. Whether it's your first time planning or you're looking for a second opinion, we'll help you bridge the gap between where you are today and the retirement that you've worked so hard for. I'm Dr. Brock Bennion for Kimball Creek Partners, and until next time, make it meaningful.